Often, when a new era begins in history, a myth for that era springs up simultaneously. The myth is a preview of what is to come, and it contains sage advice for coping with the psychological elements of the time. In the myth of Parsifal's search for the Holy Grail, we have such a prescription for our modern day. The Grail myth arose in the 12th century, a time when many people feel that our modern age began. Ideas, attitudes, and concepts we are living with today had their beginnings in the days when the Grail myth took form. One can say that the winds of the 12th century have become the whirlwinds of the 20th century. The theme of the Grail myth was much in evidence in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. We will be using the French version, which is the earliest written account, taken from a poem by Chrétien of Troyes. There is also a German version by Wolfram von Eschenbach. The English version, Le Morte d'Arthur, by Thomas Malory, comes from the 14th century, but by that time it had been elaborated a great deal. The French version is simpler, more direct, and nearer to the unconscious. Therefore, it is more helpful for our purposes. We must remember that a myth is a living entity and exists within every person. You will get the true living form of the myth if you can see it as it spins away inside yourself. The most rewarding mythological experience you can have is to see how it lives in your own psychological structure. The Grail myth speaks of masculine psychology. This is not to say that it is confined to the male, for a woman participates in her own inner masculinity, though it is less dominant for her. We must take everything that goes into the myth as part of ourselves. We will have to cope with a dazzling array of fair damsels, but must see them too as parts of the masculine psyche. Women too will be interested in the secrets of the Grail myth, where every woman has to cope with one of those exotic creatures, the male of the species, somehow, as father or husband or son. Also, a woman partakes quite directly of the Grail myth as a story of her own interior masculinity. Especially as modern women take more part in the masculine world by embracing a profession, the development of masculinity becomes important to her. A woman's masculinity or a man's femininity is closer than one realizes. The insight to this myth will be immediate and practical for our present time.
The Fisher King. Our story begins with the Grail Castle, which is in serious trouble. The Fisher King, the king of the castle, has been wounded. His wounds are so severe that he cannot live, yet he is incapable of dying. He groans, he cries out, he suffers constantly. The whole land is in desolation, for a land mirrors the condition of its king, inwardly in a mythological dimension, as well as outwardly in the physical world. The cattle do not reproduce, the crops won't grow, knights are killed, children are orphaned, maidens weep, there is mourning everywhere, all because the Fisher King is wounded. The notion that the welfare of a kingdom depends upon the virility or power of its ruler has been a common one, especially among primitive people. There are still kingdoms in the primitive parts of the world where the king is killed when he can no longer produce any offspring. He is simply killed, ceremonially, sometimes slowly, sometimes horribly, because it is thought that the kingdom will not prosper if the king is becoming weak. This myth tells us that years before, early in his adolescence, when he was out wandering around in the woods doing his knight errantry, the Fisher King came to a camp. All the people in the camp were gone, but there was a salmon roasting on a spit. He was hungry. There was the salmon roasting over the fire, and so he took a bit of it to eat. He found that the salmon was very hot. After burning his fingers on it, he dropped the salmon and put his fingers into his mouth to assuage the burn. In so doing, he got a bit of the salmon into his mouth. This is the Fisher King wound, and gives its name to the ruler of much of our modern psychology. Modern suffering man is the heir to this psychological event which took place culturally some 800 years ago. Another version of the story has it that the young Fisher King was overwhelmed with amour one day, and was out hunting for some experience of his passion. Another night, a Muslim pagan, had had a vision of the true cross and was out searching for some expression of his quest. The two came within sight of each other and, like true knights, Each lowered visor and lance and went at the other. There was a terrible clash. The pagan knight was killed, and the Fisher King received the wound in his thigh which blighted the kingdom for so many years. Such is the crucible within which the highest evolution can take place, or a deadly conflict capable of psychological destruction. I shudder at the implications of this clash, for it leaves us the legacy of our sensuous nature killed, and our Christian vision terribly wounded. Hardly a modern man escapes this collision in his own life, and he may end up in the sad state described in our story. His passion is killed, and his vision is badly wounded. Much is to be learned from the symbol of the wounded Fisher King. The salmon, or more generally, the fish, is one of the many symbols of Christ. As in the story of the Fisher King coming upon the roasting salmon, a boy in his early adolescence touches something of the Christ nature within himself, but touches it too soon. He is unexpectedly wounded by it and drops it immediately as being too hot. But a bit of it gets into his mouth, and he can never forget the experience. His first contact with what will be redemption for him later in his life is a wounding. This is what turns him into a wounded Fisher King. The first touch of consciousness in a youth appears as a wound or as suffering. Parsifal finds his Garden of Eden experience by way of the bit of salmon. That suffering stays with him until his redemption or enlightenment many years later. Most Western men are Fisher Kings. Every boy has naively blundered into something that is too big for him. He proceeds halfway through his masculine development and then drops it as being too hot. Often, a certain bitterness arises because, like the Fisher King, he can neither live with the new consciousness he has touched, nor can he entirely forget it. Every adolescent receives his Fisher King wound. He would never proceed into consciousness if it were not so. The Church speaks of this wounding as the felix culpa, the happy fall, which ushers one into the process of redemption. This is the fall from the Garden of Eden, the graduation from naive consciousness into self-consciousness. The Fisher King wound may coincide with a specific event, an injustice, such as being accused of something we didn't do. In Dr. Jung's autobiography, he tells that once his professor read all of Jung's classmates' papers in the order of their merit, but didn't read Jung's paper at all. His professor then said, "There is one paper here that is by far the best, but it is obviously a forgery. If I could find the book, I would have him expelled." Jung had worked hard on the paper, and it was his own creation. He never trusted that man or the whole schooling process after that. This was a Fisher King wound for Jung. According to tradition, there are potentially 3 stages of psychological development for a man. The archetypal pattern is that one goes from the unconscious perfection of childhood to the conscious imperfection of middle life to conscious perfection of old age. One moves from an innocent wholeness in which the inner world and the outer world are united to a separation and differentiation between the inner and outer worlds, with an accompanying sense of life's duality, and then, at last, to enlightenment, a conscious reconciliation of the inner and outer in harmonious wholeness. We are witnessing the Fisher King's development from the first stage to the second stage. One has no right to talk about the last stage until he has accomplished the second stage. One has no right to talk about the oneness of the universe until he is aware of its separateness and duality. We can do all manner of mental acrobatics and talk of the unity of the world, but we have no chance of functioning truly in this manner until we have succeeded in differentiating the inner and outer worlds. We have to leave the Garden of Eden before we can start the journey to the heavenly Jerusalem. It is ironic that the two are the same place, but the journey must be made. A man's first step out of the Garden of Eden into the world of duality is his Fisher King wound, the experience of alienation and suffering that ushers him into the beginning of consciousness. The myth tells us that the Fisher King wound is in the thigh. You may remember the biblical story about Jacob wrestling with the angel. He was wounded in the thigh. A touch of anything transpersonal, an angel or Christ in the guise of a fish, leaves the terrible wound that cries incessantly for redemption. The wound in the thigh means that the man is wounded in his generative ability, in his capacity for relationship. One version of the story has it that the Fisher King was wounded by an arrow that transfixed both testicles. The arrow could not be pushed through, nor could it be withdrawn. Again, the Fisher King is described as being too ill to live, but unable to die.
Much of modern literature revolves around the lostness and alienation of the hero. Moreover, we can see this alienation in the countenance of almost everyone we pass on the street. The Fisher King wound is the hallmark of modern man. I doubt if there is a woman in the world who has not had to mutely stand by as she watched a man agonize over his Fisher King aspect. She may be the one who notices, even before the man himself is aware of it, that there is suffering and a haunting sense of injury and incompleteness in him. A man suffering in this way is often driven to do idiotic things to cure the wound and ease the desperation he feels. Usually he seeks an unconscious solution outside of himself, complaining about his work, his marriage, or his place in the world. The Fisher King is carried about in his litter, groaning, crying in his suffering. There is no respite for him, except when he is fishing. This is to say that the wound, which represents consciousness, is bearable only when the wounded is doing his inner work, proceeding with the task of consciousness, which was inadvertently started with the wound in his youth. This close association with fishing will soon play a large part in our story. The Fisher King presides over his court in the Grail Castle, where the Holy Grail, the chalice from the Last Supper, is kept. Mythology teaches us that the king who rules over our innermost court sets the tone and character for that court, and thus our whole life. If the king is well, we are well. If things are right inside, they will go well outside. With the wounded Fisher King presiding at the inner court of modern Western man, we can expect much outward suffering and alienation, and so it is. The kingdom is not flourishing. The crops are poor, maidens are bereaved, children are orphaned. This eloquent language expresses how a wounded archetypal underpinning manifests itself in problems in our external lives. Every night there is a solemn ceremony in the Grail Castle. The Fisher King is lying on his litter, enduring his suffering, while a procession of profound beauty takes place. A fair maiden brings in the lance which pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion. Another maiden brings the paten which held the bread at the Last Supper. Another maiden brings the Grail itself, which glows with light from its own depth. Each person is given wine from the Grail and realizes their deepest wish even before they voice that wish. Each person, that is, except the wounded Fisher King, who may not drink from the Grail. This surely is the worst deprivation of all, to be barred from the essence of beauty and holiness when just those qualities are right in front of you. It is the cruelest of all suffering. All are served except the Grail King. All are conscious that their very center is deprived because their king cannot partake of the Grail. No worse or frightening pain is possible for us than to realize that our capacity for love or beauty or happiness is limited. No further outward effort is possible if our inward capacity is wounded. This is the Fisher King wound. A true myth teaches us the cure for the dilemma which it portrays. The Grail myth makes a profound statement of the nature of our present-day ailment and then prescribes its cure in very strange terms. The court fool, and every good court has its resident fool, had prophesied long ago that the Fisher King would be healed when a wholly innocent fool arrived in the court and asked a specific question. It is a shock to us that a fool should have to answer to our most painful wound, but this solution is well known to tradition. Many legends put our cure in the hands of a fool or someone most unlikely to carry healing power. The myth is telling us that it is the naive part of a man that will heal him and cure his Fisher King wound. It suggests that if a man is to be cured, he must find something in himself about the same age and about the same mentality as he was when he was wounded. It also tells us why the Fisher King cannot heal himself. and why, when he goes fishing, his pain is eased, though not cured. For a man to be truly healed, he must allow something entirely different from himself to enter into his consciousness and change him. He cannot be healed if he remains in the old Fisher King mentality. That is why the young fool part of himself must enter his life if he is to be cured. A man must consent to look to a foolish, innocent, adolescent part of himself for his cure. The inner fool is the only one who can touch his Fisher King wound.
Parsifal. The story now turns from the Fisher King and his wound to the story of a boy who is of so little consequence that he has no name. He was born in Wales, at that time a country geographically on the fringe of the known world and a cultural backwater, the least likely place for a hero to appear, and it reminds one of another hero who was born in an unlikely place. What good could come out of Nazareth? Who would ever think of Wales as possibly producing an answer to our suffering? Myth informs us that our redemption will come from the least likely place. This reminds us again that it will be a humbling experience to find our redemption from the highly sophisticated wound of the Fisher King. The origin of the word humble traces back to humus. It means of the earth, feminine, unsophisticated. This reminds us of the biblical injunction, except ye become as a little child, ye cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. In his typology of the personality, Dr. Jung observes that every educated person has one superior function of the four functions of feeling, thinking, sensing, and intuiting, which make up the human temperament. Also, as a part of our psychology, there is an opposing, inferior function. While our superior function produces most of the high value of our life, the more developed personality strengths, it also leads us into our Fisher King wound. Our inferior function, the part of us which is least differentiated, will heal us from that wound. So it is the innocent fool from Wales who will heal the Fisher King. The boy is of such lowly origin that he has no name when we first meet him. Later we will learn that his name is Parsifal, innocent fool. The name also has a deeper meaning, he who draws the opposites together, and foretells his healing role, something like the meaning of the Chinese word Tao. Dr. Jung describes an occasion when he was forced to rely on just this faculty in himself. The falling out between Jung and Freud occurred over the nature of the unconscious. Freud said that the unconscious is the repository of all the inferior elements of the personality, the unvalued things of one's life. Jung insisted that the unconscious is also the matrix, the artesian well from which all creativity springs. Freud would have none of this, so the two parted. That was a frightening experience for Jung, since he was young and untried, with no reputation of his own. It looked as if he were finishing his career before it began. Dr. Jung knew where to search for the cure of his desperate wound, and looked to his inner world. He locked himself in his room and waited on the unconscious. Before long, he was down on the floor, playing childish games. This led to the recall of his childhood fantasies, which soon filled his attention. For months he labored daily in the privacy of his fantasy, and in his backyard he built stone villages, towns, and forts. He had fantasized all of this as a boy. He trusted his childlike experience, and that was the beginning of an outpouring from the collective unconscious, from which we have the legacy of Jungian psychology. A great man was humble, earthy, humble enough to trust his Parsifal for his cure. Parsifal, we will call him that, though he does not have a name till much later in the story, is raised by his mother, whose name is Heart's Sorrow. His father is dead, and he knows nothing of him. He has no brothers or sisters. The redeeming hero in mythology often has no father, and is raised in humble and lonely circumstances. Parsifal grows up in a primitive, peasant way, wears homespun clothes, has no schooling, asks no questions, and is completely untutored. Early in his adolescence, he's out playing one day when 5 knights came riding by, wearing all their impressive regalia. The scarlet and gold trappings, the armor, the shields, the lances, all the accoutrements of the knighthood. They dazzled poor Parsifal so completely that he dashed home to tell his mother he had seen 5 gods. He was on fire with this marvelous sight, and decided to leave immediately to join the 5 wonderful men. His mother burst into tears after seeing there was no way to stop her son from following in the footsteps of his father, who had been a knight and who was killed in some foolishness. His mother had tried to shield Parsifal from knowing anything of his lineage, but no mother has ever succeeded in keeping her son from danger when his father's blood begins to stir in him. Heart's sorrow, for this is the character of the moment as viewed by any mother, then tells Parsifal that his father had been a knight and been killed rescuing a young woman. His 2 brothers were knights and had also been killed. Heart's sorrow had taken Parsifal to a remote place to raise him in hope he could be shielded from a similar fate. Heart's sorrow gives Parsifal her blessing and releases him from her protection. She cannot resist giving him advice as he leaves, to respect fair maidens and not ask too many questions. Also, he receives the gift of a single homespun garment she has woven for him. These are the legacies she bestows upon him. These gifts will reverberate throughout the whole story and be instrumental in many of the complexities of what follows.
Parsifal goes off happily to find his 5 knights and begin his career as a man. Parsifal asks everyone he meets, where are the 5 knights? The look in an adolescent's eyes when he searches for his 5 knights is the question, where is it? The it always being only vaguely defined. A youth has had his first glimpse of meaning and value in the form of the 5-ness of life, and he searches throughout most of his adult life for experiences that will embody this quality. The number 5 implies the completion of life and is the root from which we form our word quintessence, the 5th essence. 5 implies completion. The 5 is everywhere, but elusively also nowhere. It seems cruel to flash a vision of completion to a 16-year-old boy and set him on the road to find embodiment of that quality, but such is the motivation of any true spiritual life. In his searching, Parsifal comes to a tent. He never had seen a tent before, for he had grown up in a simple hut. The tent is the most magnificent place he has ever seen, so he presumes he has come to the divine cathedral of his mother's stories. He bursts into the tent to worship and finds a fair damsel. This is the first of a glittering, dazzling, incomprehensible array of fair damsels whom Parsifal will meet. Parsifal remembers his mother's instructions to treat women fairly. He also remembers not to ask too many questions. He proceeds to cherish the fair maiden by embracing her and taking the ring from her finger as a talisman. This will be his inspiration for the rest of his life. Have you ever seen a boy on his first date? He is always Parsifal blundering into the fair damsel's tent for the first time. Parsifal had been told by his mother that he would have all the nourishment, all the food that he would need for his life in God's church, and it is all there before him in the form of a table set for a banquet. The damsel is waiting for her beloved knight who is courting her, and she has spread out her best for him. But to Parsifal, this is prophecy working out perfectly. Here is God's temple. Here is the fair damsel. Here is everything he could wish to eat. Everything is just as his mother said it would be. Parsifal sits down to eat at the table and finds that life is good. The damsel by this time is becoming aware that she is in the presence of an extraordinary person. She is not angry, for she sees that before her is a truly holy, simple, guileless person. She implores Parsifal to leave immediately, because if her knight comes and finds him in the tent, Parsifal will be killed. Parsifal obeys the maiden and leaves the tent, believing that life is good, just as his mother had taught him. Parsifal asks everyone he meets how he may become a knight. He is informed that he should go to Arthur's court, where he will be knighted by the king if he is strong and brave. He finds his way to Arthur's court, where he is laughed out of the great hall for his naivete, the look of his homespun garment, and his rashness at asking to be knighted. He is told that knighthood is an arduous life, and that to be made a knight is an honor won only after much valor and noble work. Parsifal asks again and again until finally he is brought before King Arthur himself. Arthur, a kindly man, doesn't scorn Parsifal, but tells him he must learn a great deal and be versed in all the knightly arts of battle and courtliness before he can be knighted. Now there is in Arthur's court a damsel who has not smiled nor laughed for 6 years. The legend in the court is that when the best knight in the world appears, the damsel who has not smiled for 6 years will burst into laughter. The instant this damsel sees Parsifal, she bursts into laughter and joy. The court is mightily impressed with this. Apparently, the best knight in the world has appeared. Here is this naive youth, this boy in a homespun garment, completely untutored, and the maiden is laughing. Extraordinary. Until the Parsifal part of a man's nature appears, there is a feminine part of him that has never smiled, that is incapable of happiness, and she bursts into laughter and joy at the sight of Parsifal. If one can awaken the Parsifal in a man, another quality in him immediately becomes happy. When the court sees the maiden laughing, they treat Parsifal more seriously, and King Arthur knights him then and there. Parsifal returns to Arthur and says, "I have a request. I want the horse and the armor of the Red Knight." Everyone laughs uproariously because there has not been a knight in King Arthur's court strong enough to stand up to the Red Knight. Arthur too laughs and says, "You have my permission. You may have the horse and the armor of the Red Knight, if you can get it." As Parsifal leaves Arthur's court, he is met at the door by the Red Knight. This wonderful being is strong enough to do as he wishes without fear, for no one in the court can oppose him. He had taken the silver cup, the chalice, and no one was strong enough to stop him. As the last insult, he had thrown a flagon of wine in Queen Guinevere's face. Parsifal is dazzled by the Red Knight with his red armor, his scarlet tunic, his horse's trappings, and all the stuff of knighthood. Parsifal stops the Red Knight and asks for the armor. The Red Knight is amused by the young fool before him, and with a guffaw replies, "Fine, if you can get it." A brief battle follows in which Parsifal is knocked ignominiously to the ground, but as he lies there, he throws his dagger at the Red Knight and kills him by a wound in the eye. This is the only killing Parsifal commits, and it represents a very important part in the development of the young man. Esther Harding, in her book Psychic Energy, discusses at length the evolution of psychic energy from the stage of instinct to the stage of ego-controlled energy. The moment that Parsifal kills the Red Knight, he relocates a very large sum of energy from the Red Knight, that is instinct, to himself as ego. One can say this is the moment when he leaves adolescence and becomes a man. A further development is required of him when he again relocates the sum of energy from the ego to the self, or to that center of gravity which is greater than any personal life. But that story is for later in the myth.
Parsifal subdues many knights in his career, but none are killed. He extracts a promise from each knight he conquers that he will go to the court of King Arthur and put himself in the service of that noble king. This is the cultural process operating in a man in the midsection of his life, where he conquers one center of energy after another and puts them under the control of the noble king. This is truly the process of nobility in a man's life, and is the highest good for that middle section of his career. The victory over the Red Knight may happen outwardly or inwardly in a young man's life. The two ways are equally effective. If he is to follow an outer path, as most do, he must overcome some great obstacle. Many a Red Knight victory takes place on the playing field, in competition, or in some feat of endurance, or in winning a battle of some other sort. One of the bitter dimensions of life is that winning is generally at the cost of another's loss. Perhaps this is the Red Knight killing. Victory seems sweetest in the presence of another who has lost. This may be inherent in masculinity, or it may be a phase of evolution which will one day be surmounted. At present, subduing the Red Knight is often fierce and bloody work. There is also an inner dimension possible for Red Knighting. A boy may conquer a rough or rude sum of energy inside himself, overcome a bully or a clever cheat within. This is equally effective in making the transition from boy to man. This is the native language to the introverts of our society. If the Red Knight battle goes badly, either inwardly or outwardly, that sum of energy will go rampant in the personality and emerge as a bully, a vandal, or an angry young man. It can also take the form of the beaten and defeated, shy man. The Red Knight is the shadow side of masculinity, the negative, potentially destructive power. To truly become a man, the shadow personality must be struggled with, but it cannot be repressed. The boy must not repress his aggressiveness, since he needs the masculine power of his Red Knight shadow to make his way through the mature world. Parsifal now owns the Red Knight's armor and his horse, for in those days, to conquer was to own. This is to say that the Red Knight energy is now under Parsifal's control and is his to use. He tries to put on the Red Knight's wonderful armor, but he has never before seen anything so complicated as a buckle, and he cannot manage the armor. A page, who came out of Arthur's court to see what the battle was about, assists Parsifal in the mysteries of buckles. The page urges Parsifal to take off his awful one-piece homespun garment, which is unbefitting to a knight. But Parsifal refuses and clings to the one-piece garment given to him by his mother. This action is to have serious repercussions later, and it will take all our powers of comprehension to see what is implied in this clinging to the mother's garment. Parsifal puts on the armor over his homespun garment and rides away. What boy does not impose his newfound knighthood over his mother complex? The stern stuff of chivalry works very badly when it covers a mother-complexed man. One more mystery remains. Though he can get his horse started, no one has ever taught him how to stop a horse. He rides all day until both horse and rider stop in sheer exhaustion. Have you some memory of a project you began in your early youth, which started easily enough, but stopping it eluded you? Parsifal now discovers Gurnamond, a godfather. A godfather is such a boon to a boy at the time he is turning into a man. One's own father has probably worn out, or the communication has grown thin about the time a boy reaches adolescence. He is far from independent, but he is also too proud to go to his father with intimate matters. It is a rare household today where intimacy still happens between father and adolescent son. At this moment, the boy needs a godfather, a man who will continue to train him after his father has lost contact with him. Gurnamond is the archetypal godfather and spends a year training Parsifal in the ways of knighthood. Gurnamond teaches Parsifal information vital to attaining manhood. He must never seduce or be seduced by a fair maiden, and he must search for the Grail Castle with all his might. Specifically, he is to ask a certain question: whom does the Grail serve when he reaches the Grail Castle? What would knighthood be worth if it were not for this noble end? Both of these instructions from Gurnamond are worthy of discussion and will soon find their place in our narrative. After receiving these instructions, Parsifal suddenly remembers his mother and goes in search of her once more. Perhaps we can stand only so much of masculinity before we need to be in contact with feminine mother energy again. So off he goes to hunt for his mother. He learns that soon after he left her, she died of a broken heart. You remember, her name was Heart's Sorrow, which is part of motherhood. Naturally, Parsifal feels dreadfully guilty about his mother's death, but it is also part of his masculine development. No son ever develops into manhood without, in some way, being disloyal to his mother. If he remains with her to comfort her and console her, then he never gets out of his mother complex. Often a mother will do all she can to keep her son with her. One of the most subtle ways is to encourage in him the idea of being loyal to her. But if he gives in to her completely, then she often finds herself with a son severely injured in his masculinity. The son must ride off and leave his mother, even if it appears to mean disloyalty, and the mother must bear this pain. Later, like Parsifal, the son may come back to the mother, and they may find a new relationship on a new level. But this can only be accomplished after the son has first achieved his independence and transferred his affection to a woman, either in an interior way with his own inner feminine, or in an exterior way with a real female companion of his own age. In our myth, Parsifal's mother died when he left. Perhaps she represents the kind of woman who can only exist as mother, who dies when this role is taken from her, because she does not understand how to be an individual woman, only a mother.
Many people set forth on their journey through life in good faith, but with very little psychological understanding of why they are going on that particular journey, or of where it might take them. Sometimes they do have an intended goal, but fail to achieve that goal. Often fate will serve them unexpectedly, and a far deeper purpose may be accomplished. So it is with Parsifal's search for his mother. He finds instead Blanche Fleur, which means white flower, and comes into awareness of the highest motivation of his life before the Grail encounter. Blanche Fleur is in distress, and her castle is under siege. She implores Parsifal to rescue her kingdom. Obeying that profound law, a man knows not his strength until it is needed, he frees her domain of the intruders. He does this by searching out the second-in-command of the besieging army, dueling heroically with him, sparing his life at the last moment, and sending him in fealty to the court of King Arthur. He repeats this with the first-in-command. We are seeing the first of a long series of encounters that will add to the fellowship of the Round Table. This is a poetic way of describing the process Dr. Jung speaks of as relocating the center of gravity of the personality. A careful and highly conscious process of drawing from the untamed pool of masculine energy and adding to the conscious center of the personality, which is here represented by King Arthur and his Round Table. No endeavor is more noble or heroic than this ideal in the first half of one's life. It is in the service of Blanche Fleur that Parsifal performs his heroic task. She is his lady fair and the carrier of inspiration, the very core of heroic action for everything Parsifal accomplishes. It is not by accident that it was the mother search which led the blundering Parsifal to she who will inspire, truly the animating principle of life. It is a moment of poetic beauty to find what Dr. Jung called this inspirer in a man's bosom, the anima, she who animates and is the fountain of life in the heart of man. Blanche Fleur indeed deserves her name. Her conduct in the rest of the story would be bitterly disappointing if one were to consider her a flesh and blood woman, for all she does is remain in her castle as a symbol of inspiration, or perhaps a talisman of affection, when Parsifal occasionally comes dashing back for a moment of her beauty and trust. But taken as that interior feminine, deep in the heart of a man, she is the very core of inspiration and meaning. A rose from her hand or a glance of approval is sufficient to provide motive and strength for the most heroic of deeds. Though this principle is couched in medieval terms and is encased in the stuff of chivalry, it is no less present in the most modern of men. After raising the siege from her castle, Parsifal returns to spend one night with Blanche Fleur. We are given a detailed account of how they slept together in the most intimate embrace, head to head, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, knee to knee, toe to toe. But the embrace was chaste and worthy of the knight's vow that he never seduce or be seduced by a fair maiden, a vow he must keep if he is to win a vision of the Grail.
Chastity. Gurneman's instruction never to seduce a woman or be seduced by her is of such profound importance to our story that it is worthy of consideration in its own right. It is important to remember that we are studying a myth, much as one would study a dream, and many of the same laws apply. A dream is almost entirely an inner matter, and every part of a dream is to be construed as part of the dreamer. Example: if a man dreams of a woman, it is almost certain that his own feminine inner capacity is being addressed. It is only too easy to literalize such a dream figure and explain it as one's sexual interest or a comment on one's current girlfriend. If one makes this error, the true depth of the dream will be lost. So also in myth. If we take Gurneman's instruction in a literal sense, we will have little but a caricature of medieval chivalry before us. What is this inner femininity from which Parsifal is to remain aloof? It is all the softness of femininity that is so valuable in an inner sense, but that would enfeeble him if he mistook it and lived it in an outer sense. Feeling is the ability to value. Mood is being overtaken or possessed by the inner feminine. To feel is the sublime art of having a value structure and a sense of meaning, where one belongs, where one's allegiance is, where one's roots are. To be moody is to be in the grips of the feminine part of our nature, to be overwhelmed by an irrational element that plays havoc with a man's outer life. The feminine side of a man is to connect him within the depths of his inner being and to make a bridge to his deepest self. Often a man has to make a choice between feeling and mood. If he is engaging in the one, there is no room for the other. A mood prohibits true feeling, even though a mood may appear to be feeling. If a man is engaging in a mood, or more accurately, when a mood has engaged him, he automatically forfeits the ability for true feeling and thus for relationship and creativity. In the old language, he has seduced or been seduced by his interior feminine. A man never wears his feminine outwardly with any validity. A man overwhelmed by a mood is a sundial in moonlight, telling the wrong time. His interior feminine serves him well as la femme inspiratrice, inspiration, when she is rightly placed. But she does not serve him well when he wears her as an outer garment and uses her to relate to his outer world. Uses is the pertinent word here. Anyone and everything around a man feels used when he relates to the world by way of a mood. Seduction indeed. Feeling, on the contrary, is a sublime part of a man's equipment and brings with it warmth, gentleness, relatedness, and perception. We often project our relationship, or lack of one, with our inner feminine onto an outer flesh and blood woman. Human woman is a miracle in her own right, a beauty which will be obscured if we try to put the laws of inner woman upon her. So, too, is the inner woman clouded if we treat her in an outer way. A man has only two alternatives for relationship to his inner woman. Either he rejects her and she turns against him in the form of bad moods and undermining seductions, or he accepts her and finds within himself a companion who walks through life with him, giving him warmth and strength. If a man falls under the spell of a mood, that is, if he misconstrues her as being out there, he loses his capacity for relationship. This is true whether it be a good mood or a bad one. Creativity in a man is directly linked with his inner feminine capacity for growth and creation. Genius in a man is his interior feminine capacity to give birth. It is his masculinity which gives him capacity for putting that creativity into form and structure in the outer world. Goethe, in his masterpiece Faust, came to the noble conclusion late in his life that it is the province of man to serve woman. He ends Faust with the lines, "The eternal feminine draws us onward," certainly a reference to the inner woman. To serve the Grail is to serve the inner woman. The worst characteristic of mood possession is that it robs one of all sense of meaning. Suddenly, the out there is dominant in one's inner life, and the inner meaning of life is lost. One is then at the mercy of the out there for one's sense of value or happiness. One is so tied to a new purchase or gaining the favor of someone that he is unaware of his own inner meaning, which is the only stable value he has. Mood possession also robs him of the objective world and its true beauty and magnificence, a deep meaning in its own right. A man is not master in his own interior house when he is in a mood. A usurper has taken his place, and the man's response will be to fight the usurper. Unfortunately, he often chooses to fight this battle on the wrong level. In other words, he will fight with his wife or his environment instead of facing the battle within, which would be the only appropriate action. Mythology describes the hero's battle with his internal self as the encounter with the dragon, and modern man has no fewer dragon battles than did his medieval counterpart. You can update mythology and make it dramatically alive if you can find the modern stage on which the dragon battles. Even fair maidens and red knights will play out their drama.